Priscilla also told the author, I told no one because I thought I wouldn't see Elvis anymore. I thought Curie would never do it again. So she's relaying to the author that, by the time that happened, even though it was an attempted R, she was still so scared because he was still her ticket to go see Elvis every time. Something had occurred prior to this evening that not only suggested a motive for Priscilla to allege that Curie tried to R her, but that also could explain why they offered different versions of their entire relationship. Not only the relationship, but the timeline when they met, all of it. And if she had indeed, allegedly, according to Curie, given herself to Curie a few weeks prior in order to meet Elvis, then that right there shuts down the future of her relationship with Elvis, right? That shuts down any possibility in the future of her marrying Elvis, because he has now communicated to her that virginity is such a sacred thing to him, especially in a future wife. This is the key to the entire thing. This is why Priscilla is so insistent and so desperate to conceal this fact that she was a huge Elvis fan, because if it's known that she was, then Curie's story becomes more and more and more plausible. What would a huge mega fan do in order to gain access to their idol? Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm so happy to have you. Today we're on episode 12 of Child Bride by Suzanne Finstad, the untold story of Priscilla Presley, and chapter 12 is called A Question of Virginity. Now, if you have not caught up on any of the episodes, I will link the playlist down below or somewhere here on the screen. I said this in the last episode. At the very least, I want you to go back 2 or 3 episodes, because it's very important to lay the groundwork to take you to where we find ourselves in this chapter. But in this chapter, Priscilla and Elvis have met each other. They are spending quite a bit of time together in Germany. She, a 14-year-old 9th grade schoolgirl, and Elvis, a 24-year-old international superstar. There's a lot going on that led her to this point. The biggest thing is that there was a man named Curie Grant who took her to go meet Elvis for the first time. He was a friend of Elvis's in Germany. He was also in the military. And there's a very fierce debate, even to this day, between Priscilla and Curie about the nature of their relationship and what it entailed to get her to the point where she finally met Elvis. So if you want to learn all that backstory, go ahead and click on those episodes. I just want to get into this one, you guys, because this one is a lot. And I'm going to preface it by saying that we're going to be talking about a lot of subjects where I'm going to have to mouth a lot of words to the camera. I don't want to have to go back every single time I say a certain word and have to blot it out. So I'm just going to mouth the words. If it looks like I'm doing that, I am doing that. There's just words that are triggers here on YouTube that I don't want to run into any problems with. We're all adults here. You can pretty much figure out what I'm saying. But I've also linked the book Child Bride underneath the video. A lot of you guys have said that you are reading along with me. You have the book and you're just enjoying the commentary. And I think that will be really fun if you want to do that. So this book, it's quite a heavy book. I am reading from my Kindle just because it's a little bit easier for me during filming, but that's what's going on there. So here we go with chapter 12, A Question of Virginity. So starting off chapter 12, the author Suzanne Finstad tells us that Priscilla was not the only girl who was romancing with Elvis in that fall of 1959 in Germany. Apparently there was a 15-year-old German girl by the name of Helly Primmel, who was nicknamed Legs, and basically she would be leaving the house as Priscilla would be coming in. So it seemed like Elvis had quite a revolving door where girls were concerned. Now, Priscilla, according to Curie, knew the rules though. She would never ever complain, and she would never bring up the fact that Elvis was seeing other girls at the time, unlike, for example, Helly, who would mention it, and eventually she was ousted. It seemed like Priscilla was fiercely determined. She was just happy to spend time with him, and she didn't want to usurp her place there and get potentially kicked out for being too disruptive or asking too many questions of Elvis. And the author tells us the stress and insecurity for a 9th grader in that position would have broken a girl who lacked Priscilla's iron will. Not only was Elvis romancing Helly in front of her, but he still enjoyed an occasional interlude with his young German secretary named Elizabeth, who later married one of his entourage, a man named Rex Mansfield. The rivalry for Elvis Presley's affection was keen, and Priscilla was demonstrating that she played to win. And so we're back to the routine that Curie, Grant, and Priscilla found themselves in the early stages of Priscilla and Elvis's relationship. He was still entree to Elvis's world, and Priscilla was very calculating in that she didn't want to rock the boat too much, and she knew that she had to kind of play nice with Curie in order to, make sure that he would be receptive enough to want to keep returning her back to Elvis's house, even though, according to Curie and Priscilla, by all accounts, at that point, it's not like Elvis was calling up Priscilla's home himself saying, I'd like to see you, or coming to get her himself. It was always just Curie bringing her, and according to Curie, basically whenever he felt like it. Elvis wasn't demanding of Curie certain dates and times, so it was all at Curie's disposal what he wanted to do. And apparently the back and forth routine between Priscilla and Curie was, if Carol, Curie's wife, wasn't with them when they were driving over to Bad Nauheim to see Elvis, Curie would just basically pepper her with questions all the time. Like we talked about in the last chapter, always peppering her with questions, what was going on during the intimate time with Priscilla and Elvis in the bedroom. And she would just talk about how they would make out, how they would talk a lot, how he would fondle her, all that type of stuff. And Curie talks about a particular time early in Priscilla and Elvis's relationship where he got excited during Priscilla's descriptions of what was going on with her and Elvis up in Elvis's room. He said that he pulled the car off of the Autobahn hoping for a quick tryst with her because apparently, according to him, allegedly in past chapters, we found out about how he tells the story of taking supposedly Priscilla's in the hills of Wiesbaden. That was the price that he enacted of her in order to even take her to see Elvis for the very first time. So according to him, he's already had his way with her. He's excited by listening to her describe her time with Elvis. So like the sicko that he is, he says, yeah, I tried to pull the car over. I tried to initiate something with her, but he describes her as being very cold, being very standoffish. She wants nothing to do with him. And he just kind of was like, okay, I see what's happening here. He calls it the old syndrome, where whenever he would make the mistake of taking a girl to meet Elvis, whenever the girl had been with Elvis, she then thereafter wanted nothing to do with this guy. Now, he's 27 years old. He's 3 years older than Elvis at the time, married with 2 of his own children. But he's telling the author that, this is what I did. I was an addict and I just kind of just needed to have it all the time. I was always cheating on my wife. This is basically what he was doing during that time period. So that's why when he met Priscilla and he found her to be so intriguing and so beautiful, fell off his chair when he found out how old she was, but still he said that didn't deter him, right? But by that point, he knew better. He knew that if he wanted to get anywhere with her, he would have to have his way before he took her to meet Elvis. So at that point, when he's trying to pull over and initiate with something with her, after she's already been with Elvis, she's not receptive at all. And he's just like, okay, here we are. It's like, just like those other girls all over again. This is the old syndrome. This is what happens once they've been with Elvis. They want nothing to do with him. Now, according to Priscilla, this wasn't just him pulling over, trying to start something with her not being receptive, and then he just let it go. According to Priscilla, she says that Curie tried to her and she made a huge fuss, kicking the car doors open, yelping, laying on the horn, all this kind of stuff. And he was so frazzled by all the noise that she was making that he just cut it off and stopped. And Priscilla also told the author, I told no one because I thought I wouldn't see Elvis anymore. I thought Curie would never do it again. So she's relaying to the author that, by the time that happened, even though it was an attempted R, she was still so scared because he was still her ticket to go see Elvis every time. So I guess in relaying the story in that way to the author, she's communicating to Suzanne that even though he did attempt to R me, I was just still frightened that, if I didn't go with him in the future, I might not see Elvis. But this is where things start to take an interesting turn. This is what the author tells us. Something had occurred prior to this evening, meaning the evening where Priscilla said it was an attempted R and Curie just says, well, he just tried to have his way again and she wasn't having it, so it was dropped then and there. Priscilla's obviously characterizing it as a R type situation. So continuing here, Something had occurred prior to this evening that not only suggested a motive for Priscilla to allege that Curie tried to R her, but that also could explain why they offered different versions of their entire relationship. Not only the relationship, but the timeline when they met, all of it. Because Priscilla has said that she met Elvis pretty early on, upon arrival in Germany, but could never pinpoint to the author the exact date, which the author always found puzzling, because it's like, what starstruck 14-year-old girl wouldn't remember the date that she met Elvis Presley? But then again, Priscilla's always tried to characterize in her narrative that she was never an Elvis fan to begin with. So that's also what the author is thinking, that's probably one of the driving forces to always try to, bring that point home. If she's not a desperate to meet Elvis type of fan, then she wouldn't have given herself to Curie like Curie is attesting, right? So continuing here, it says, so that's why that there's probably different versions about the nature of their entire relationship. So it says, during one of the private talks in his bedroom, Elvis had recently revealed to Priscilla that he considered virginity sacred and that he would never date seriously or ever consider marrying a girl who had been with another man. And Priscilla told the author that was very early on. She confirmed this, quote, "It was important to him that he was the first, very important to him," end quote. And that's that scratching of the record moment in the party. And the author's like, if Elvis is asserting this to Priscilla, that this is one of the most important things that he looks for in a woman, and if she had indeed, allegedly, according to Curie, given herself to Curie a few weeks prior in order to meet Elvis, then that right there shuts down the future of her relationship with Elvis, right? That shuts down any possibility in the future of her marrying Elvis, because he has now communicated to her that virginity is such a sacred thing to him, especially in a future wife. And the author says, Elvis's old-fashioned Southern insistence on a virgin bride was the quintessential catch-22 for Priscilla Beaulieu. She had made the ultimate sacrifice, her virginity, in order to actualize her dream of meeting Elvis, only to discover that in doing so, she had effectively disqualified herself from ever becoming his wife, if he ever found out. So do you see what's happening here? It's at this point that Curie Grant becomes a liability to Priscilla Beaulieu. Can she take the risk of Curie opening his mouth and relaying to Elvis that he's basically had her first? Now it's becoming apparent more than ever that this is just a game of strategy now. This is a game now to all the players involved, including Priscilla, because now she knows that if this secret allegedly that she's been with Curie gets out, it's going to jeopardize her growing relationship with Elvis. And what's happening, right, to Priscilla's detriment, and in my opinion, is just another secret piled onto the heap of secrets, which she's been forced and is now, in my opinion, participating in, by herself in perpetuating all these secrets, all of these lies, all of these half-truths. It's just served to shape and mold who she is and how she moves through the world. This is a secret Priscilla Presley guards to this day. For the key element in the Elvis and Priscilla myth, the single powerful image in which she is most closely associated is her assertion that she was a virgin bride on her wedding night with Elvis 7 years after they met. Now, Priscilla had a boyfriend named Mike Edwards after Elvis's death, and in conversations with the author, he's saying that he always suspected that there had been something more to the story regarding Curie Grant, and that he himself did assume that they were intimate in order for Priscilla to gain entry to meet Elvis in the first place, because she had told Mike that Curie and her had had an altercation in the hills, and just based on Priscilla telling him that, even though she was saying that it was probably that attempted R that she asserts, Mike Edwards, the guy that she was with for, I want to say 5-6 years or so, something like that, even he's like not really buying it. And he tells the author, how when you talk to someone, you hear stories, you kind of listen. I thought that they did, were intimate, but I never pushed it. And I thought other things that we talked about, I always thought they did. And he never felt that she was purely innocent on her wedding night with Elvis either. And, the author is saying that this is the key, right? This is the key to the entire thing. This is why Priscilla is so insistent and so desperate to conceal this fact that she was a huge Elvis fan, because if it's known that she was, then Curie's story becomes more and more and more plausible. What would a huge mega fan do in order to gain access to their idol? People might think that she would do anything to make the fantasy happen. And we've already seen in the book what a huge fan her mother, Anne Beaulieu, was. So not only is Priscilla a fan, but the old lady's a fan too. So that's just like real hype and pressure that she's getting to want to meet Elvis. That's why she's so insistent of the fact that her family was super strict, prim and proper, and she wasn't a fan. Because if she's not a fan, then who's going to believe this Curie Grant guy who's saying that, oh, she did everything she could with me in order to meet Elvis? That serves to just basically make Curie look like a liar. And the author's saying that in her further conversations with Karen Grant, Curie's daughter, Karen's always like, yeah, every single time I've heard my father tell this story over the years, every single time, it's always Priscilla walked up to my dad and said, I heard you know Elvis, I want to meet him. And then it just all went from there. And even Karen Grant is like, I don't understand why Priscilla is running with this. That's the way it happened. And she's basically saying that she thinks it's kind of sad that Priscilla is trying to paint it any other way. So by November of 1959, the author is saying that Priscilla is writing letters back to her friends in Austin, Texas, friends that she left 5 months earlier after she graduated middle school, telling them that she's met Elvis, that she met him at a performance private party at the Eagles Club. And that's where Curie worked. He was a manager at the Eagles Club. And that's where Priscilla first encountered Curie. So she's telling her friends that that's where I met Elvis. He was performing at this private party. They met and now they're dating. And there's a girl who I guess apparently is a recipient of one of those letters. And one of the recipients of one of those letters, a childhood friend of Priscilla that we've talked about in earlier episodes, a girl named Christine Laws, said that it was just so unreal to us. Like we couldn't believe that this was actually happening. So all that's happening. So she's finally opening up a little bit, and she is spilling the beans a little bit to some of her closest friends back in Texas. And Curie's telling the author that during this timeline, during the early few, 4 to 6 weeks of Priscilla having a relationship with Elvis, when he's still in charge of whether or not she sees him and he's driving her back and forth, he's saying that, after that incident where she supposedly said he tried to R her, that nothing really came of it because he's still the one driving her back and forth. And he's still keeping up with this thing about wanting to ask her all the time, what's going on intimately between you and Elvis? What's going on? What's going on? And he's finding, though, as the weeks go by, that Priscilla's withholding more and more, but she still is telling him some things. And one of the things that she's telling him, according to Curie, he said that Priscilla told him that Elvis and her were fully intimate by the 3rd or 4th visit. Of course, Priscilla denies that, emphatically denies that. And Curie says, quote, eventually he had with her, not only once, she told me that. It was either the 3rd or 4th time, I don't know which one, end quote. And then the author's saying that Mike Stone, the man that Priscilla took up with after she divorced Elvis, the former world karate champion, that Mike Stone said that he would sometimes ask her in their relationship, but she would always keep it a secret even from him. And he was like, well, I guess that's, her prerogative not to offer up information, but he kind of didn't believe it either. He thought that there was no way that she was pure on her wedding night. And according to the author, in her interviews with Joe Esposito said that Elvis told him that he was doing everything but the actual act with Priscilla. And Curie continues with that topic, telling the author that he thinks that Elvis practiced the same method of birth control, because Curie was always cheating around with all these teenage girls. And Curie suggests to the author that he thinks that Elvis practiced Curie's basically telling the author that for a lot of men back in the day, himself included, that was just their method of birth control. and that it wasn't so much being fully intimate because you weren't taking it to the very end, so to speak. So then the weeks go by, and like I mentioned before, Curie is noticing that Priscilla is becoming more and more like clammed up when he's talking to her. He calls and says, do you want me to pick you up? And she's like, oh, he's got Lamar Fike, one of Elvis's friends. Lamar's going to come and pick me up, as if to start slowly communicating to Curie that I'm not going to talk to you. You're not needed as much. And she's basically icing him out. And Curie tells the author, I knew something was going on because she clammed up on me a little bit on the last couple of nights. Curie did not perceive himself as a threat to Priscilla because he was not aware of Elvis's virginity fetish, nor did he plan to reveal that he had been intimate with Priscilla. Since she was a minor and it was against the law, he considered the episodes in the hills their secret. However, he did suspect that Priscilla was at that point asking Elvis for another driver, another way to get to see him, probably because she told Elvis that maybe she was uncomfortable with him, maybe he was asking too many questions and she didn't like it. So Curie's thinking the closer and closer she gets to Elvis, the less and less she needs me. And at this point in the chapter, the author starts bringing up another huge source of contention between Curie Grant and Priscilla Presley. The author interviewed the two of them in May of 1996 in her home, and they fought brutally over the next thing I'm going to tell you guys about. So, this is happening. Curie's taking her over a 4 to 6 week span, right? Roughly. He's noticing as the time goes on, as she's getting closer to Elvis, she's getting more ice cold with him. She's trying to freeze him out, asking for different rides, all of that. And it says, Priscilla claims today that Curie tried to... So at this point in the chapter, Priscilla claims today, meaning at the time the book was written, 1996-ish, she claims that Curie tried to R her now a second time. That at that point, she told Elvis about both attacks and that he went crazy ballistic and he banished Curie from the house. And she explains, I was really scared of Curie. At that point, I had no other choice but to tell Elvis what was going on. Elvis was enraged and apparently banned Curie from the friend group, the house, all of it. So this is Priscilla talking to the author, and she says, I was afraid of Curie. But she had to tell Elvis. It was a very, very big decision to make because I didn't know at that time in the beginning if Elvis would ever see me again. I didn't know if he would say this isn't going to work. I had to take the chance. But fortunately for her, according to her version, Elvis was furious. He couldn't believe it. And that's why Curie, she says, never came to the house again. But at this point, Suzanne, the author, is telling us that this is very, very highly unlikely that she ran to tell Elvis this and that he got so incensed that Curie was then banned. Because supposedly, according to Curie, other people in the group, the author is saying, no, Curie was still in the friend group. He was still in the friend group and he was still spending time with Elvis and his buddies. And as we'll go into in a future chapter, and different people over the years have uncovered Curie Grant as the man who drove Priscilla and Elvis to the airport the day that Elvis left Germany in March 1960. So the author's like, no. If he had really tried to R her, then why was he still included in the friend group? And then moreover, when Curie and Priscilla met in May of 1996 at the author's home, Priscilla then tells that even after supposedly that second R attempt, that Curie had phoned up her parents and said, hey, can she come to a movie with Carol and I? And they had said, fine. She agrees to go to a movie, but when she's picked up, it's just Curie alone. And then Priscilla's like, I was really, really rattled. Why was it just him alone? I thought I was going with him and Carol. But then the author's like, okay, hold up. Why would you even agree to go anywhere with him, with his wife or not? Why would you go at all if at that point there had already been 2 attempts to R you? None of it makes sense. According to Priscilla, she and Curie drove off and he took me by the river, the Rhine River, and then he tried again. So according to Priscilla, then in her timeline to the author, according to this 1996 interview, this is now the 3rd attempt of R by Curie on her. And the author's like, Okay, well, that just even disproves everything Priscilla is saying, even up to this point, by all of her accounts, because Curie's saying he's noticing more and more and more. She's icing him out. She's not even, using him as a ride anymore. She's making sure she's getting her own ride. She's clamming up. She's icing him out. And at that point, if he did try to get intimate with her, twice before, why would she go with him to a movie? Like, none of this makes sense. So at this point, both the author and Curie are calling BS on this whole thing. They're like, okay, well, at this point, he had tried to R her twice. Why would she get in the car with him to go anywhere? Alone or even with his wife? Like, who cares? You would be so grossed out and frightened of someone. Why would you? None of this makes sense. And according to Curie and Priscilla up to that point, she was icing Curie out anyway. It was becoming more and more apparent that she didn't really need Curie as entry to Elvis. So as I've explained in other prior episodes, the author has these conversations between Curie and Priscilla taped from that interview in her home in 1996. And she puts in the chapter the back and forth. And Priscilla just says, well, yeah, I got in the car with him again because I trusted him. And, that's her whole explanation. And everyone's scratching their heads. What? Huh? Like what is going on? So they're fighting back and forth. So Curie says in 1996, when they're fighting, boy, you've made a lot of things up since I talked to you last. I mean, a lot. So then the author's got all this back and forth, and it gets to the point in the fighting where Priscilla says to him, why would I want to have anything to do with you? And Curie says, well, you've now, at that point, been with Elvis. You've accomplished what you tried to do with me. And Priscilla's like, well, what did I try to do with you? And Curie says, get me to take you to Elvis, which I did. So now you don't need to have anything to want to do with me. That's fine. I didn't object. I took you straight home that night you were talking about. So apparently this is supposedly the third time that he tried to R her, right? And the author says the timing of the alleged attacks was a weakness in Priscilla's account. She maintained that Curie did not make an advance until after she met Elvis because, as we talked about before, Curie learned his lesson from other girls that he had taken to meet Elvis. He made sure that he got in there first, according to him, allegedly. Priscilla's motivation for positioning the incidents after Curie introduced her to Elvis is clear, for she would not have wanted anyone to know that she was in a compromising position with Curie before she met her idol, or people might start believing that she was desperate enough to make the first introduction happen. And it says that Mike Edwards, the boyfriend that Priscilla had that we talked about before, he offered the most convincing proof, for Priscilla confided to him that she and Curie had an encounter in the hills before she met Elvis. And we talked about that in episode 11, where Mike said that just based on the fact that Priscilla had told him that Curie tried to attack her in the hills above Wiesbaden, in Mike's mind, that was enough of a pause for him to think, I don't think it was an attack. He asserts that he knows Priscilla and he knows, that she was a very alluring, beautiful young girl. He doesn't buy it. He alleges that he thinks that she did what she needed to do to meet Elvis. Now, in Elvis and Me, and also in the 1988 television adaptation of Elvis and Me, there is a character by the name of Kurt that Priscilla talks about. And in Elvis and Me, the book, she says that there was a friend of Elvis's whom she will call Kurt with a K, K-U-R-T, and that he's the one that tried to R her. That's the one that she told Elvis about and effectively got him banished from the friend group. So I'm going to assume that that's how she's somewhat admitting to the fact that Curie was even in her life in the first place, but it's only in the light of he was a friend, someone she didn't really know, that tried to attack her. Now, the author says that Priscilla's accounts of all these attempted R's are also inconsistent, because there was an interview that Priscilla had given prior to the interview with Curie at the author's home, where she had attested that Kurt, Curie, whomever, tried to R her 2 or 3 times. But then when she was with Curie in the author's home, she said that it was only twice. And the author's like, wait a minute, that's a huge deal. Is it twice or is it 3 times, because I'm pretty sure if it was 3, you would know for damn sure that it was 3. So there's all this stuff, all this back and forth. And again, I've said it before, but what does Curie have to stand to gain other than looking like a complete a-hole, in a disgusting one at that, in revealing all of this? He has children, already at the time that he's relaying all of this to the author. It just makes him look awful, just completely awful, taking advantage of a 14-year-old girl. And yes, we have our criticisms of Priscilla as it stands now, with this narrative that she's weaving over the decades, this persona that she's trying to perpetuate and put herself on this pedestal. But at the heart of it, at this time, yes, we have to acknowledge she was a 14-year-old. She didn't have the emotional, intellectual, physical charge in order to really, really take a grasp or a handle of what was happening to her. Like, she wasn't being protected. Everyone in her life was dictating the terms and forcing her. Essentially, when you are a child, she was forced into these situations. And here she is all these years later trying to, preserve her reputation, try to preserve Elvis's reputation. And the only way that she can seemingly do that is to paint Curie as being this complete and total degenerate, which, let's, call it what it is. He is. This is disgusting, but what does he have to stand to gain other than making himself look horrible in this whole scenario? So that's why I've said, unfortunately, I'm more apt to believe Curie than I am Priscilla. And Curie even tells the author, and he says, this is ridiculous. I am admitting to you that at that point in my life, I was an addict in that regard. I was cheating all the time. I was involved with all these girls at any point in time. I don't know if this is a brag on his part or not, but he tells the author at that point, he had at least 10 girls that he could phone up at any time and have relations with and not be hassled like this, not have to force them. He's not bragging. That's just the way that it was. And he says, quote, "We were both young and foolish back then. I was older than her, but we were still young and foolish, and this is what happened. And she can live the lie as long as she wants to, but in her mind, she knows what the truth is." Priscilla also offered different versions of when she told Elvis that Curie tried to her, whether it was after the first or the second attempt. The most glaring problem with Priscilla's account, however, was Elvis's friendliness toward Curie after she claimed to have told him. And Joe Esposito told the author that if that had really been the case and Elvis would have known, that he would have tried to kill Curie. And there's no way. And other members of Elvis's entourage at the time, like Rex Mansfield or Elizabeth Stefanik, who was the German secretary who was living in the house with Elvis at the time and was also kind of like an on-again, off-again girlfriend, they all say that no one mentioned anything to them about Priscilla's account of this, that Curie attempted to her. It was all news to them, according to the author in their interviews with her. But then it starts to get really dicey because Priscilla told Suzanne, the author, that she even told her parents what happened, that Curie had attempted to her. And that is when Suzanne really, really starts to take Priscilla to task over this whole thing. She ain't buying it. And she says, neither Anne Beaulieu nor Priscilla's stepfather, who was Curie Grant's superior officer in the Air Force, said a word to Curie after supposedly learning that he attempted to their 14-year-old daughter. She never told her parents anything, Curie disputed hotly. If she had told her parents anything, Elvis and I would probably both be in prison today. Okay, but Priscilla is still spinning this yarn and holding fast to this narrative. And she told the author that after she told Elvis that Curie had attacked her, that was it. Elvis kicked him out. He was not seen anywhere in the friend group. He was completely out of the house. Her parents maintained that he was never seen from again. They all wanted nothing to do with him. But again, contested by members of Elvis's own entourage. Rex Mansfield, one of his friends at the time, the secretary, Elizabeth Stefanik, and also another friend of Elvis's by the name of Cliff Gleaves that the author interviewed, they all said, no, Curie was around. Curie was around often at nightly gatherings at Elvis's house. He was a regular guest. He was a regular visitor. And that, in fact, Elvis was always pleased to see him. So all this is entirely inconsistent with Priscilla's version of events. And it says, in addition to the inconsistencies, inaccuracy, and implausibility of Priscilla's account, one has to consider who had the greater motivation to lie. What would Curie stand to gain? And Priscilla said, well, it's just a vendetta against her. It was a vendetta. He wants something. He wants to be known. Maybe he wants to be the man to say that he's the one that was with Priscilla before Elvis was. And that's the explanation that she's giving the author. But when you look at it from the light of the fact that Curie has never sold his story to a newspaper, to a magazine, to a tabloid, nothing. At the time of that 1996 interview at the author's home, it had been almost 40 years since he met Priscilla. His story never wavered. We've talked about this in other episodes. His story remained consistent throughout all of his tellings of it. He always looked like a total rat, but the story never changed. Whereas, as we've seen, especially in this episode and in prior episodes, Priscilla's account always wavers. Details, timelines, there's always holes, there's always these inconsistencies, right? And Curie says, at that time of that interview, he was 64 years old. It had been almost 40 years since he met her. He's not making any money off of this story. He had alleged that he was going to write a book about his time with Elvis and Priscilla. He never did. She had put forth her account and he was like, okay, well, that's the way she's telling it. I'm going to write mine. He never did though. And he told the author, I'm not trying to make up things against Priscilla. I could care less. I've had my 15 minutes of fame years ago. I don't need any more. I don't want any more. But don't sit there and look in my face and tell me I'm lying. Not when I know friggin' well it did and I was right there. I may not be Priscilla Presley. I may not be a celebrity, but it's my life too and my history, and I want it to be the truth. If I really wanted to brag that I got her first, I would have been telling people that from the time it happened until now. And that actually is pretty telling. And again, the author is really trying to drive home the point that who has the most to lose here, right? Who has the most to lose, especially when the author has Priscilla on tape during that confrontation with Curie saying, my life is on the line here. I mean, all my credibility, everything, my life, my image that I worked so hard to create. And that is very, very telling just in those words that she spoke, right? My life, my image that I've worked so hard to create, that persona that she wants us to gobble up. And the book says that Priscilla was in a panic as the debate with Curie over whom asked who to meet Elvis and whether or not they dallied in the hills and all that, as that began to escalate, she had said, quote, may God strike me dead if I'm not telling the truth, Priscilla exclaimed repeatedly. And then she fled the author's home, fled the interview, agitated, and she actually collided with another car on her way home. So Priscilla's just been telling this story so often and for so long that the author's surmising that, does she believe this? Is she in such a state of denial that she's believing her own lies? And again, she brings up John Bradshaw, who's an expert in family secrets. And that author, John Bradshaw, says that this harboring of secrets, he says, it sets up an auto-hypnotic ego defense, repression, denial, how people set up ways to not remember. And he's saying that this is largely an unconscious pattern of behavior and a way of living and thinking. It's not the same as lying to the person who's going through it. Denial protects the person's options to keep the status quo. And to Priscilla, she has to do everything she can at all costs to perpetuate the Elvis Priscilla myth that she was an innocent on their wedding night. And this is the hill that Priscilla is going to die on. And when Priscilla began writing her first memoir, Elvis and Me, in 1983, Mike Edwards, her boyfriend at the time, had told the author that he was urging Priscilla to purge herself of all of these memories, of all of this trauma, and just be honest with herself when she was writing the book. And he was saying that he was asking her to do it, but that he didn't push her because at that point it was really late in their relationship. But he kept saying, don't follow the path of denial, that you need to stop continuing the myth, that you just need to cleanse yourself, so to speak, of this. Now, the author contends that this is another in the line of traumas that Priscilla experienced as a teenage girl. And she says the reality was that Priscilla and Curie used each other, a truth that Curie had accepted. Priscilla was still in denial, and Mike Edwards, Priscilla's boyfriend, said, "I just felt sad for her," speaking of his attempts to try to push her to confront her past. He said she could have freed herself. She could have broken those chains. If she had been honest, it sets you free. She wanted to do that book and set herself free, but she didn't do it. And what has Priscilla learned her whole life? Of course, she's not going to do it. She's always going to be the keeper of secrets, which is why we find ourselves here now, 5 decades in. She's still telling the same story. Now, the author talks about the defamation lawsuit here that Priscilla took up against Curie. And it says Priscilla Presley subsequently sued Curie Grant for defamation, claiming that his account that they were intimate was false. Curie filed a cross complaint against Priscilla for slander based on her statement that he had tried to attack her, her. The lawsuit ended on August 19, 1998, when Presley and Grant entered into an agreement that resulted in the court entering a stipulated judgment for defamation against Grant. And they had also come to terms in a confidential legal agreement, which I told you about before in earlier episodes. An Elvis biographer, Alana Nash, found. She found the terms of that confidential agreement, and the terms were that Grant was not to pay Priscilla 1 red cent. She had originally sued him for millions, knowing he didn't have that kind of money, but a lot of people that are worth a lot of money try to intimidate people with lawsuits by suing them for thousands or even millions of dollars. So she didn't get any of what she was asking for in the way of millions. And actually, she ended up paying thousands to Curie for some photos that Curie had taken of Priscilla for Elvis in the early 1960s. And also, one of the terms was that she could no longer publicly say that Curie tried to her. So he's not paying her anything. She can't say that he tried to attack her and her, but yet he can't speak of her publicly either. So on its face, it seems like she won that, but did she really? Well, it just seems to me all very, very dicey. And you know what? There was another thing I was thinking about as I was finishing up this chapter. If indeed Priscilla's account is true, if she did tell Elvis and her parents that Curie tried to her, tried to attack her, don't you think that the circumstances surrounding this entire situation would have been drastically different? If that is the case, why wasn't this criminal activity reported? Why didn't Priscilla's father take matters into his hands and report him to his military superiors, right? Or, Priscilla maintains that Elvis was so incensed that, he was just going to kill him and he banished him from the group and all that. And it's like, okay, say that happened. Say he was banished, right? And that he never was seen at Elvis's house again, or he never darkened the doorstep over at the Beaulieu household. If this was indeed true, then don't you think that he would have probably retaliated? He probably would have. He had everything at his disposal, all the power at that moment to tell on Elvis, to tell what Elvis was doing, to tell Priscilla's family what was happening himself. He could have done that. He could have been retaliatory in that way, gotten Elvis in trouble, and then things would have never happened the way that they did. This is just so hard to swallow. Like, I can't buy this. I cannot buy Priscilla's accounts of this because none of it makes sense. He had everything that he needed to retaliate on all these people, but he didn't. And he didn't, in my opinion, because he never was banned, because Priscilla never told Elvis that she was attacked and, that he tried to her. She didn't tell her parents that either, because in my opinion, the attempted probably didn't happen. Do I think that he was a sleazeball still trying to get intimate with her while she was talking to him about everything her and Elvis were doing? Well, yeah, I do. He sounds like a sleaze to do that. But I don't think that the way Priscilla is spinning it is the way that it happened. So what do you guys think about this? I know this has been a big one. Again, this has been a lot to unpack. There's just so many layers to this. It is disturbing. It's a lot to digest. I've talked about it in the past. Yes, it was wrong. What was happening to Priscilla was wrong. Make no mistake about it. We're talking about Elvis here, and we're talking about Curie. She was a 14-year-old girl. None of this should have happened. This is how it happened. This is how it went down, according to the author. I believe the author. I believe the people that the author is interviewing. I don't believe Priscilla's accounts of it. I can see why she wants to die on this hill. I don't really understand it. Although I could see her drive to want to do it, I don't really agree with it. I really think she should absolve herself of all of these half-truths and lies she's been telling over the years. I really think that she will find peace when she does that. I'm in the middle of reading her second memoir that she wrote and released last fall called Softly as I Leave You. I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm reading in that particular book in future chapters, because the first one she wrote, Elvis and Me, was more about her very early years, her time with Elvis right up until Elvis's death. And Softly as I Leave You kind of picks up after Elvis's death, where she talks more and more about relationships that she had after Elvis's death, raising her daughter, raising her son, Navarone, moving and navigating through life after Elvis. So it's kind of like a continuation in her story, although she does harken back to her time with Elvis. There are things that she retells, things that she's already talked about in Elvis and Me, but I am finding the tone and the way that she's relaying her accounts and her memories, it's all along this same vein. It's all about keeping the image, keeping the narrative pristine. She's telling us things, but then she's not telling us things, if that makes sense. For example, she's talking about the relationship with Lisa Marie, how that evolved and, was good sometimes, but was bad a lot of the times. She talks about Lisa Marie's marriage to her fourth husband, Michael Lockwood, the musician that she has her two twin daughters with. And she talks about the breakdown and deterioration of that marriage, but she doesn't address at all these scandalous accusations that Lisa Marie was making against Michael Lockwood at the time. Her and Michael were just embroiled in this bitter custody battle. And Priscilla glosses over things, but she doesn't say what was happening. Now, I understand that she doesn't have to go into painstaking detail over every little thing, but she doesn't even provide us details that you could get just from reading an online article as to what Lisa and Michael were fighting about, what Lisa was accusing Michael of. Lisa was basically accusing Michael Lockwood, that she was fighting in a divorce at the time, of finding questionable material involving children on his computer. And that was one of the charges she was leveling against him in order to gain full and sole custody of their twin daughters. And when Priscilla's writing about it, she's just like, yeah, she's just asserting that he wasn't a good father. And I'm just like, what? Like, Priscilla, what do you take us for? Again, you don't have to go into, creepy, crazy detail, but at least give us what we could get from just reading an online article about what Lisa was saying about the guy. It's exhausting. It's exhausting. And it is entertaining. I know that Priscilla had a co-author, but I do like the way that Priscilla sets up the book. Every single chapter in Softly as I Leave You, she starts with a little Elvis lyric that kind of pertains to and kind of matches the mood and tone of each chapter. But I don't know. I'm still really feeling that she's very guarded. She's very guarded. She's just not gonna let us in for nothing. And I'm telling you, it goes back to that childhood of secrets, that childhood of being fiercely guarded, of wanting to control everything around you, feeling like, it's you against the world and you have to protect yourself at all costs, to your own detriment, really. If she would let us in, if she would just admit to things, if she would just tell it like it is, I do think she would find peace. And I don't think that too many people, even nowadays, would really fault her. Obviously there's things that are disturbing in her childhood, that are disturbing about the way that her and Elvis's relationship started when she was at such a young, tender age. Of course, there are disturbing things like that We know how it ended though. We know that they did eventually get married, that they had a beautiful daughter together, that she ran his estate and played a part, although not the only part, in keeping his legacy alive, all of that. So like there are positive, good aspects that came out of their union, but it's just, stop trying to sugarcoat and put a cherry on the top of everything and make everything seem just so in a certain way. I think she would do herself so many favors, her and us, if she would just lay it out straight. I don't think she's ever going to do that. So I'll talk more about Softly as I Leave You and what I'm reading about in that book as we go further on into Child Bride, because in Child Bride now here, we're still focusing on her early years, her early teenage years. But as the book goes on, because I've read the whole book, it gets really juicy too into how she navigated through the world after Elvis's death and how she worked the business and how she was pretty shrewd in some of the decisions that she made. But I'll kind of intermix what I'm learning about or what she's telling us in Softly as I Leave You, and I'll weave it into the later chapters of Child Bride, which follows Priscilla later in her 20s, her 30s, and her 40s and beyond. So that is all I have to say about this one. I know it's been a long one. It's been a long one and it's been a little distressing at times. The next chapter in Child Bride is going to be chapter 13. It's going to be called Dark Fairy Tale. Now, as you've noticed, I do have the book listed underneath the video if you wanted to pick it up. A lot of you guys have said like, hey, I have the book and I'm following right along with you. I'm enjoying reading it and listening to the commentary. So again, let me know what you guys think about this particular chapter in the comments down below, and I will see you very, very soon for the next chapter. Bye.